Hello and welcome to this edition of One on One. I'm Paranjoy Guha Thakurta in the studio of Lok Sabha Television here in New Delhi. And in this edition of this program, we are going to discuss the valuation of electromagnetic spectrum, which is used by telecommunications companies, by mobile telephone companies. The recent public auction of third generation or 3G spectrum has yielded the government huge amount of revenues, much higher than what was anticipated. In fact, the finance minister had anticipated about 35,000 crores, but the government is going to end up getting well over 100,000 crores. Whereas the government is naturally overjoyed that it's getting such a huge amount of money from this public auction of telecommunication spectrum, the current valuations also indicate how this scarce national resource was undervalued when it was allotted in 2008. To discuss this issue, I have with me a member of parliament, a member of the upper house of parliament, Mr. Rajiv Chandrasekhar. He represents the Bangalore Urban District, an independent member of parliament who has been writing various letters on the subject to the Prime Minister, to the Union Minister for Communications and Information Technology, all the way from early 2007 onwards. And for the benefit of our viewers, Mr. Chandrasekhar is also a former president of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry, an apex body of business, big business companies. And he himself is an entrepreneur, a chairman of Jupiter Capital, which is a venture capital company with a net worth of 4,800 crore rupees, with interest in various industries, including the media. Thank you, Mr. Chandrasekhar, for coming here. I'd first like you to explain, for the benefit of our viewers, what is this whole electromagnetic spectrum? Why is it a scarce and therefore a precious national resource, and therefore it has to be allotted in a wise manner? To a layperson, it's just thin air.
It's actually, despite efforts to try and make it simple, it remains a complicated subject. But let me try and explain this to you in the following manner. When anybody picks up a cordless phone or a walkie-talkie, you will notice that there is an antenna, and the antenna, at the back of the cordless phone, it will say 450 megahertz or 60 megahertz or 20 hertz. What that means is anything that today is wireless operates on a frequency, and the frequency is a designated number, and the band of the frequencies in which you can operate mobile telephony is a finite band. So it could be 450 megahertz, 850 megahertz, 950 megahertz, 1.3 gigahertz. Therefore, given that these bands on which commercial mobile telephony can operate, or the numbers of frequencies that they can operate, are finite, the resource spectrum
is scarce.
Okay. And this is not true for India, it is true worldwide. Every nation therefore has a certain specific finite band of spectrum that is available for commercial exploitation by cellular mobile telephone operators.
Correct. Because that same spectrum has to be used by various agencies. You have the Department of Space, Correct. You have the Meteorological Department, you have the Defense Authorities, television. So, in a sense, the government, which is supposed to act as a custodian of resources that belong, after all, to the people of this country, Correct. And a scarce resource, has to act in a fair, impartial, unbiased manner, Correct. While allotting the spectrum. So therefore, the importance of the government comes in. Now, what has been our past experience in using spectrum? Because what happened is, when we had this huge mobile telephony boom, there was a shortage of spectrum, especially in the densely populated urban zones, the metropolitan areas, because from what I understand, the defense authorities, the defense services had a huge amount of spectrum, and they went about giving it up very slowly because they wanted an alternative network before they would allow private mobile telephone operators to use this spectrum.
Yeah. Now let's look at this way. I think it's easier to explain it this way. Pre-1990, pre-1991, before private sector was invited into cellular, the users of the spectrum were predominantly the government. So there could be MTNL, BSNL on one end for telephony, and there was a defense, because the defense used in the early 90s and before that depended a lot on Russian equipment for telecom, microwave equipment, radar, and so on and so forth. And the Russian equipment were predominantly in the bands that we now need for commercial cellular mobile telephony. So historically, the legacy of spectrum utilization in India is that it was predominantly used by the armed forces and PSUs like BSNL. And post 91, when the concept of a private telecom operator took birth, there was increasing pressure for that spectrum to be shared between the private operator and the defense and the public sector users of the spectrum. And so going back to the history of spectrum, in the early days when the government's policy was to try and create a nascent private telecom industry, to create competition and to create consumer benefit, the spectrum was allocated to these operators because the businesses were untried, high risk, on, let's say, more liberal terms. So the pricing of the spectrum wasn't as high as, let's say, you are seeing today in 3G. Because it was a new industry, and therefore there was an argument that could be made that
you have to encourage
investments
sector,
and so on and so forth. And so that was a valid argument for the early 90s and, let's say, the late 90s. And then if you fast forward now to an industry where each company is capitalized at billions of dollars, and the costs of equipment and the capital costs of the early 90s, which were phenomenally high,
have come down
dramatically. There is a very, very legitimate argument that companies need not be given any more subsidized spectrum, and there is the argument for market determination of prices.